O ye Kerskeen and Krajidau, the Golashkeen and Ea, the Common Comulti now, Marish and Garadea. Coot vad an soul as Creechan Brish, Col Tayach Sirid Kia, as Glek the Crime at Tejanish, na Pega Ostangia.
I think anyone who's, a good Manx speaker or a knowledge of the the history of the Isle of Man, certainly post-war history, will be aware of DeValera's trip and also the importance of the language, I think.
It all came about originally because Eamonn DeValera paid an informal visit to the Isle of Man in 1947, and he met Ned Madrill over there, who was in charge of the museum, and Ned was one of the native speakers himself and was very concerned that the language was really almost extinct at that stage. So he asked Eamonn DeValera was there anything he could do about that, because there hadn't been proper recordings made of the language. So Eamonn DeValera said, yeah, no problem, he would go to the Folklore Commission, which he had set up himself in 1935. But unfortunately the Irish Folklore Commission were only using wax cylinders, and they had nothing really suitable to do this. They were looking into trying to get outside broadcast set up for outside broadcasting, but they hadn't really got any proper equipment. So Eamonn DeValera made sure that they got funding for that. Imagine setting up a whole government department to go out and record people speaking Irish, and initially that was the brief, to go to the Gaeltacht areas. But they were very much aware that the Irish language itself was in danger, and these long folk tales that took 3 nights to tell, that tradition was all changing and all moving, and if they didn't record that material, it was gone, and gone forever, the oral literature in Ireland. So initially the Folklore Commission's brief was to collect folk tales, folk songs, music not so much, because they couldn't really, they just hadn't the facility to do long pieces of music and that. But afterwards that all changed, particularly once they had the large disc cutting machine and they had the equipment and things. Now it took from, that was in 1947, it was 1948 really before they got everything together, because they had to purchase a van, they had to purchase it took a while to set everything up and get all the blank discs, and Kevin Danaher went over, and it set up, the nice thing about this trip was that everybody loved Kevin Danaher.
Kevin Danaher was sent over here by the Irish Folklore Commission, and he arrived in 1948, and he had his brand new recording equipment that he had basically built and put together himself in his new recording van, and it was, in his own words, slung onto a cattle ferry, and it was put in the hold, which was unfortunately underneath the cattle. So during the night, as they came over, the cattle did what cattle do, and they could barely see the van in the morning. And he managed to get in the van without too much disturbance, as he says, and he drove up here to the Manx Museum, where he was met by Basil McGaw, who was the director of the museum, and he yelled out to him, "Don't get out of the van!" And he called for a man with a big hose and a bucket of water to hose the van down so he could get out safely.
Kevin, you went to the Isle of Man as a result of Mr. DeValera's urgings, let us say, to record the last native speakers of Manx. Would you tell us a little bit about your experiences on the island?
Oh yes, well, we had an Gaeltacht, that is the Gaelic Association of the Isle of Man, helping us there, and they had several very, very good people who, again, like our own collectors here, knew the old Manx speakers and could take us to them. It was exactly like being at home. In about 3 or 4 or 5 days of listening to Manx, my ear was tuned to it, and I could understand it almost as well as I understood Irish.
Beach Marcus van Cormian show and Coragan as straight Green Gold Seas that August Thai as say you Thai.
And as we did at home, we got all degrees of material from people who are really storytellers of the like, people like John Tom Cahan or Harry Boyd or and Gaudo or Ned Maddrell, who was perhaps the best of them all.
The famous Ned Maddrell.
Captain Ned Maddrell from Greenish.
And these people you were put in contact with them by the Manx Gaelic Society.
Well, they took us, they came with us there to it. Yes, yeah.
And they responded by recording for you, and you made the disc.
We made the disc just as we would at home. Yes.
And these discs, I believe now, are, of course, the originals are held here in the Department of Irish Folklore, but I believe that copies have been supplied.
Oh, yes, copies were supplied at that time to the Manx Museum.
Those recordings could not be made today.
Of course they couldn't. I think that of all the people I recorded from, there's only one of them, as far as I know, alive now.
This is a kind of gramophone recording unit. It's not quite the same one that was used at the time, but it's this type of machine they had. Sometimes they recorded from the inside out, and you had to clear away all the wax, or not the wax, but the lacquer as it was being cut, or sometimes they recorded from the outside in. The recording, Kevin Danaher was really good at the technical side of things, and the standard was really good.
I'm from the south of the Isle of Man, Port St Mary, but a lot of my family come from a small village called Cregnish, which is at the very tip of the south of the Isle of Man. And a lot of my family called Karen, which is a common Manx surname. But there was one of the native speakers recorded by the folk commission, one called Eleanor Karen. And she was older than Ned Maddrell, who's the person that DeValera met. She was maybe a little bit more nervous, reticent about speaking in a way. And sometimes the conversations, people like Ned Maddrell sort of dominated. I think Ned Maddrell was almost he didn't like a gap, so he's trying to fill the gap in with, I've got to keep on speaking and stuff. Maybe it would have been nicer for maybe a more experienced sort of interviewer to give him time to someone like Eleanor Karen to speak more, because she was clearly extremely fluent and a great idiom and grasp of the language. But and maybe the dynamic, you never know, the dynamic in Cregnish and all that sort of stuff meant that someone like Ned Maddrell would dominate over and above someone like Eleanor Karen. But even when I was young, part of my interest in Manx would have been from my relatives saying that they sort of lived part of the year in Port St Mary, and then in the summer when tourists came here, whilst the rest of the family would go to Cregnish and in a very old croft, how much Manx was being spoken actually, much more than people realise, I think, and they would hear Manx a lot. Phil Gorn was the Manx Language Development Officer before me, and he was working predominantly for the Manx Museum at that time, and he brought together, he wasn't the only person working it, but he brought together a book called Skeal and Vannin, which was published by the museum, which was a book of CDs and the transcripts of the recordings of the Irish Folklore Commission. They're available online now. But that's 20 years ago, I suppose now, so the best part of 20 years ago, I'm not quite sure, it's a long time. So, and Phil is important in that, one I think the interesting comparisons between Manx is also a comparison with other island jurisdictions such as Jersey and Guernsey, where there are still native speakers of their Norman French languages, but very, very few people under the age of 60. Most of their speakers are in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And I always think the comparison is interesting, why the Isle of Man had a big revival of interest to the extent that it is now, compared to similar sort of physically and constitutional jurisdictions which have seen significant language loss. And when I was asking one person, a language activist in Guernsey, why, one of the things they said, yeah, we've never had people like Brian Stoll or Phil Gorn.
I suppose for these purposes I was involved with the production of this fantastic book, Skeal and Vannin. The There was a friend of mine, Sean O'Brody, who took a great interest in Manx Gaelic and was very supportive, particularly during my time as language development officer. And Sean invited me over to have a look at this fantastic collection in the Irish Folklore Commission. He basically said, there are these wonderful discs, you should come and you should see them. And listen to them if at all possible. So Sean arranged the visit, and I came over, and indeed it was fantastic to see. There was not only were the discs, the original discs there, but it was also possible to see some of the associated materials with the recordings, photographs and the like. And of course I came back to the island very enthused by all this and said, yeah, we really need to make this happen. We need to make the recordings far more accessible. Obviously I spoke to people in Manx National Heritage, and a project was developed. Not only did the Irish Folklore Commission come to the island and do this wonderful stuff, and it's really a valuable resource for speakers now, but they also inspired and Cheshire Gilgach, the Manx Gaelic Society, to actually go out and do its own series of recordings. Perhaps we were embarrassed into the fact that, you know, a bunch of people had to come all the way over to Ireland to make the first significant amount of recordings.
So what would I say to Eamonn DeValera? Well, I'd say I'm really pleased that he made that application to the Folklore Commission to send that recording van that he never knew didn't exist to the Isle of Man, because that's what made it happen. That's what made Kevin Danaher put the van together, build it all, bring it to the Isle of Man and collect what is an immense body of work.
In some ways, it's a shame that the native speakers aren't around today in a way, because I think they'd be dumbstruck by something like a Manx medium school. You know, there's over 1,000 children learn Manx in schools. There's loads of people learn it, adults. It's very visible. It's on the radio. Lots of books. Been a remarkable upturn in fortunes for the language. In some ways, it's a shame they're not round to see the consequences of their hard work in a way.
And Achim show nach Bunden lead. Jai Daniels feed the Ginver Street, that's Puda as all Fiedol Tatch. Brig Lily Vai was Liverpool, cause Africa vai carried gold. A Stirramur and Gaty Chan, Sjach.
Carga Mau, come Ricklish poor to Trugget Nish, to G the Golden Dow. Nyatal Screesnery, the charm just share now. Son add to Cradle and Smackry ye, doch noid to Liggett Row. A share steed de Credol, le Slen and Nyatas Bree. Gol son a carga spirit dole, Slen Ele carga ye. As Vedach Peggy, Sheeras Glen, as you Glen and Screes.
I didn't be roof wagon then, no? Then we class and
Some of the fire and ferry,